Okay. So, Erev Tov. Happy to see people that are coming back. Happy to see everybody. Today, we're going to touch on the concept of free choice, which is, again, not a new concept for our era. Bchira chofshit, free choice, is something we already read in Bereshit, right? But it is definitely different today when our choices are not limited by what we see on one hand. So we have this infinite reality of choices, even though we don't imagine ourselves as prophets, or at least most of us. So even though we don't think we can see the Ein Sof, we don't think we can see the divine, we still can envision an infinite number of choices. And on the other hand, or at the same time, we live in a very logical, scientific world. Okay? So we think we understand all choices. So we'll try to see today how all of those play out and how can we reconcile a world of free choice and a world of halacha and Torah. So I'm sharing the screen through the source sheet. It was also sent in the WhatsApp group for those who want to see it in different, if they watch it over their phones or somewhere else. And we'll just start reading again. As we said last week, feel free to stop at any time. I'm reading the Hebrew. I'll paraphrase into English as we go. So we first start with Rav Ginsburg. Rav Ginsburg, for those who don't know, is a Hasidic rabbi, very known in Israel. Very, let's say, if we try to put him on a spectrum of right and left, not politically, but within the religious world in Israel, also politically, but for that matter, within the religious world, he's definitely to the right side of the Tilumi of the Orthodoxy in Israel. And he's also very influenced by philosophy, by science, physics, new physics, and so on. So I'll read and then we'll see what he says. אז בסגנון החילוני-מדעי, הסוגיה היא האם וכיצד ניתן ליישב את הבחירה החופשית עם ההיגיון הסיבתי. Right? How can we reconcile free choice with reasoning, with logic? תפיסה מדעית קיצונית גורסת שלכל דבר שקורה בעולם יש סיבה שמכריחה אותו. For everything that happens, there's a reason that is forcing this to occur, right? If we would have all the data globally, we could have build a computer, we could predict anything accurately, how and what is going to happen, right? And I'm reading here. יש סיבה מדוע בחרתי לעשות מעשה מסוים ולא מעשה אחר. There's a reason why I chose, and he put it in quotes, why I chose A rather than B. It could be psychological, it could be biological, it could be molecular, it could be all at the same time. And this is where we put choices into brackets. Because really, this feeling, this notion that I'm choosing is nothing but imagination. In fact, the entire reality, including man and its conscience, is just a rigid, right, system. We could amuse ourselves about this computer that is sincerely say what I will choose to have in dinner. Meaning, basically what Rav Ginsburg is saying, we have this notion of free choice, but really we are atoms and we are slaves to physics, right? We can't just imagine ourselves to choose whatever we want. And then he says, however, we need free choice. העיקר הזה כל כך יסודי, right? So fundamental in our life that without it, there's no place for commandment. There's no place for warning on tzachar ve'onesh, right? You can't be punished for something you are forced physically to choose. It's just not plausible, right? האדם שאיתו אפשר לדבר על עיקרי אמונה, the man which you can speak with about faith is a choosing person, right? And only in radical circumstances, free choice is being taken away from man as a punishment on his sins or bad deeds and so on. Judaism emphasizes choices so much that it seems that something that's threatened us more than anything is that our ability to choose will be taken away from us, right? And this is it says a fundamental element of um, psychoanalysis in anxiety and so on. Meaning, we think we can choose, but because we understand the physical world so much, we also know we can't choose. How can we reconcile both? What Gilford is saying, and I'll be happy to hear voices as well on this, but what he's saying is this is exactly where faith is important. Meaning we don't believe necessarily in God, in the Ein Sof, in the divine. That's not where our faith begins. It's not where our religion begins. Our faith, believing, starts with believing we can choose, even though we know that's not logical. If we believe we can choose, which is something we can't know because we know it's not true. We know choice is, as we said, physical, it's mandatory, right? If we still, even though we live in a scientific, hyper-scientific world, if we still believe we can choose, then our faith begins from it. That's our seed to our faith, and it's the origin. Without this, we can't be Jewish. Our Jewish identity is founded on this concept of choosing, of believing in choosing. Okay. Before I'll say what I think of it, I'll be happy to hear your thoughts on this. Okay. So I'll say for me, it's a challenge personally, right? And feel free to say you disagree. But for me, it's very challenging because I many times think that it's an illusion, right? This hyper-scientific world where we know what's going to happen is an illusion. And really, we don't know what's going to happen. We want to believe what's going to happen is we can predict it because we want to believe we have control over nature, over the world. We want to believe we have control over ourselves. But really, there's not a lot of control. There's a lot of, the variations are infinite. And because they're infinite, in reality, we can't even predict them. So I disagree with Ginsburg on his premise. Naturally, he's much more knowledgeable than me, definitely scientifically and halachically and philosophically on all accounts. So, I'm not here to judge him or to say anything against that, but I am to say that I think it's also okay, at least from my perspective, to still believe in somewhat of a naive reality, maybe even a bit childish reality. Childish, as they say in Hebrew, and not laduti, meaning not juvenile, not something childish as a derogatory term, but rather as something that is still innocent, and to believe in that aspect. If there's any comment on of Ginsburg on this before we move on. Okay, so we're moving on to another big problem. Okay, and then we'll later see how both of those problems weave together. Another problem in our reality is that if we have free choice, we're losing control. Meaning, free choice at the past was a choice between mitzvah ve'avera, between good and bad. It was pretty clear. The world wasn't black and white before postmodernism or before modernism. For sure, gray was always there, and that was the reality. However, still, there was something specific in the world. You knew if you're choosing against something, you can't say you're still in favor of it. You knew roughly what the boundaries are. Today, you could say, I'm Jewish, for example, or even to say I'm frum, or I'm Hasidic, or whatever, and to act in a way that most Rabbanim, most poskim, most people that are part of that community would say you're very different from us. But you would still define yourself as such and see yourself sincerely as such. Meaning the choices are allowing you to identify yourself as something else, right? Both globally and within the Jewish context. And there's a beautiful section here by Rav Shagar from an article he wrote about education and ideology. Again, I'll read in Hebrew, I'll paraphrase as we go. השתתפתי בסימפוזיון עם אחד מתלמידי תלמידיו של הרב קוק. Right, so he was in this panel. המשמש כראש ישיבה, נבהלתי מהאמירות הרדיקליות שלו ביחס לחופש. And Rav Shagar says he himself was startled by how radical his statements about freedom was. הייתי בטוח שהנה בעקבות דבריו, החבר'ה אורזים את המזוודות ונוסעים להודו. So Rav Shagar was certain how, this Rav was speaking about freedom and freedom of choice and so on and so on. So much that all of his yeshiva would just pack up their bags and go to India. But it didn't happen. Right? אך מתברר שכמו הבדיחה על בחור הישיבה, as the joke on this yeshiva bucher that went to the slaughterhouse and said, this is the holy Kukevan. I'm not sure how you translate Kukevan. If anybody knows, he can say. Or she can say. הקורקבן הקדוש של הגמרא, this is the קורקבן. משום שלא האמין, because he didn't believe the קורקבן is an actual organ within the animal. כך גם לגבי החופש הקדוש. This is also about this sacred freedom. אין לו ולא כלום עם החופש שאליו הורגים תלמידיו של אותו ראש ישיבה. It has nothing to do with the freedom that the students of this Rosh Yeshiva are looking at. Right? It just doesn't exist. כך הופך גם החופש שעליו דיבר הרב קוק לאידיאולוגיה. This is how freedom itself becomes the ideology. Because there's a gap between the concept and the existence. A gap that didn't exist with the Rav Kook. Rav Kook was speaking, for those who are not familiar with Rav Kook's teaching, Rav Kook was speaking a lot about giving the students and the community members a place to choose and be in full faith and believe that whatever they will choose, it will be a sacred choice that will advance our world into Geula, right? If their choice would really come from within, from their faith. So he had like a very radical notion of basically the student can choose almost anything. And he went to the kibbutzim. He was with the chalutzim that were anti-religious, secular, right? And he danced with them and he was with them because he really believed their freedom as sacred. However, as he says, most of the freedom people are in our age, in our era, are talking about is fake. It's a fabrication. It's not freedom. This freedom is totalitarian. A lot more than the traditional commandment to obey, to accept Ol Malchut Shamayim, right? Because it assumes, it requests that you will choose mitzvot rather than be commanded to be mitzvot. So it's sort of forcing you to freely choose to be commanded, right? Rather than really be free and then approach commandments from there, right? You really, and what Rav Shagar is saying here, and I think it's a very radical notion. What Rav Shagar is saying here is that we can really take ourselves seriously only if we will put freedom as a real concept. If we'll allow freedom of choice in our time and era on all of its dangers, sincerely. Imamash will allow ourselves to choose everything and allow our students to choose everything and allow our family members to choose everything. This will, and only this will allow that freedom to be sacred. Okay? This is a very radical notion. I also assume it's different from most of the communities of the people that are attending this shiur or watching the recordings. I've seen a lot of people watching the recordings, sometimes more than the shiur, until now more than the people that are participating. So I'm talking to everybody because it looks to me, and I'll be happy to hear from the people. I'm sitting from Jerusalem and saying this. I'll be happy to hear from the people that are listening and talking. What does it mean to you? Because the context, I think, of the American Jewish community and the Frum American Jewish community is very different. So I'm opening this up, and I'll be happy to hear from you. I see, Aviel, you're raising an eyebrow, so I'll be happy to hear exactly what does it mean to you.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I had a question. He says, הפער המופרז בין הרעיון לקיום הפך לבלתי נסבל אצל הנוער של היום, מושרש בתרבות החילונות. So, what's the connection? I didn't understand that so much.
The secular reality within Rav Kook is an ideological secularism. Okay, so it's a socialist, ideological, conceptualized people that are secular as a value. Okay, today, Rav Shagar is saying, and I think it was true when he wrote this a couple of decades ago, and I think it's also true today. Today, secular, not only Judaism, in general, secular reality is not secular as a value, as a virtue. It's secular by reality, meaning people are secular because the world is secular. It's not that they're secular because they're against religion or because they're socialist or something like that. They're secular because that's the world, okay? So there's a gap between the concept, okay, of the ideological concept of secularism and the reality that people are just secular without really, sitting and deciding they are secular. Am I answering your question? Yes? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, my connection is a little bit shaky, but I think so. So he's basically saying that because people are so kind of influenced by their context, they don't have the possibility of choice anymore. So when they speak about free choice, it's not, especially because the religion has been made so inner, that it doesn't seem like Kabbalah all from outside, but something that is like so inner that it's not really a choice anymore.
What do you mean when you say so inner? When you see it as something too inner, what do you mean?
He says, that I think, and maybe I just misunderstood, when he talks about the way free choice is taught, he says that it's taught in a way which doesn't really make it a choice because people don't sense the freedom to live in a completely different way because they're so used to the way they're brought up.
Right. Yes. So, but he said, but he's putting that as a criticism, right? That's not the value he wants to promote. That's his criticism about people that are using the notion of freedom only as a rhetorical vessel, rather than as a real value of free choice. Okay. Thank you for your comments. Anyone else that wants to comment on this? Okay, so we're moving on. And now there's another concept here that is, and when we are taking freedom of choice seriously, then changes could happen. And what happens, and that's also, by the way, from an article of Rav Shagar about Hilchot Medina, law within the Israeli state, and how do we address it. I'm sorry, Rav Shagar, it's like it didn't came up. But in any case, what's happening when things are changing? And he takes a ruling, I won't read this, but I'll just paraphrase it in English. There's a ruling from the Rabbanut, right, from the chief rabbinate, from a Beit Din of the Rabbanut that sat and discussed what we can do with with all sorts of legal dinei chozim, all sorts of things. I won't go into the halachic discussions here. It's not our topic. But eventually they said, we could accept, right, things, if they have some validity by the law of our state, and they become how people are accustomed to, how people are working. Right? We address it as kinyan. It's a discussion about kinyan. Again, I don't want to go into this, but basically what they say, we can change kinyan, we can change the halachic concept of when kinyan is taking place, even when the halacha stated something differently, when the law of the state and everybody in the state are acting in a certain way in Israel, right? Given it's in a Jewish state, or the majority are Jewish, and it's not really a Jewish state, but a state of Jews, then that's a minhag hakila, and there's kinyan here. Right? Nisuach goref zeh, this broad stroke, is מבטא בצורה חריפה, is really expressing the total acceptance of rules and laws of the states in a way that is not beneath Torah, the dinim of the Torah, the original dinim of the Torah. And that's a huge shift from what the Chazon Ish, that's a very known and a big posek within the Haredi world in Israel, right? And it's different. It goes more like the Khatam Sofer. But again, I don't want to go to the halacha discussion. But what's happening here, and he says here, their approach is pragmatic. Okay, it's a Haredi approach, but it's pragmatic. How so? And the path, the way of the Chazon Ish could have been very problematic practically. And they ask to enable an existence of a mutual, a shared economical sector where from religious Jews could function within it. And that's why they're allowing and they are okay with just giving away all of what the definitions of kinyan, of dinei mamonot, with the state. And that's how dinei mamonot are losing their validity, they're losing their grasp. Okay? And that's huge. It's huge. Another example, maybe even bigger, in Rav Shagar's story itself. He's talking here about the chuppah. In the chuppah, as we know, the man is giving a ring to the woman. It says Arat Mekudeshet Li, and that's the kiddushin, right? There's a minhag, unrelated to Jewish circles, that exists, let's say, for at least a few decades, maybe a century, that a woman is also giving a ring. Okay? Now that minhag sifted into Jewish circles in Israel and also to religious circles. And now the question, what do you do? Right? So, because halachically, what does that mean if the woman gives the ring? Or what does that mean? So there's a solution. Some of the Tzohar is a rabbinical organization in Israel, is saying, after the Sheva Brachot, the Rav is saying, okay, Kiddushin is over, and then the woman gives a ring to the husband with her own nusach, she's saying something else. So there's a separation between the halachic structure and another ceremony which is giving an expression to the egalitarian worldview of the couple. Okay? Now, when Rav Shagar was teaching this at the yeshiva, he said, even though it's not halachically forbidden, it doesn't smell good because it shows lack of faith in the spirit of halacha. Because this couple are saying, we don't accept the entirety of the Torah, we have another value we want to share. But the students rebel against Rav Shagar's position, right? And they said, no, it's not artificial, it's something we believe in, we cherish. And then Rav Shagar is saying this something very interesting. בהקשר הנוכחי, our current context, הטקס הכפול מבטא בצורה המלאה ביותר את המידור הקיים בתוכנו פנימה. Our own identity is divided. This ceremony, which is double, reflects how we, as human beings, have multiple identities. Our honesty, this honesty demands us to let go of the classical Zionist religious perception that seeks harmony. It's also, I think, the classical, is at least similar to the classical American Orthodox way, meaning there should be harmony between halacha and meaning, between the values of Torah and the values outside of Torah. And this approach, what Rav Shagal is saying, we need to be schizophrenic and not decide. Okay, we don't need to be intimidated by multiplicity of identities and by conflicts within our identity. We don't need to see ourselves committed to one identity. Okay, this fuzzy boundaries between halacha and the spirit of Torah, between tradition and new values, this schizophrenic way enables us to remain within halacha, to allow halacha. Even though reflective, we can say there's a change in our values. The halacha is not mere formality. It continues our tradition. However, we still have more opinions that are not traditional. And this new concept that this puzzle, right? We put the halacha together with other components, enables us to face reality. So what Rav Shagal telling us here is that free choice doesn't only enable us to really take freedom seriously or request us to take, it also requests us in our time to add more components to our identity that are not exclusively halachic. It's not to change the halachic ceremony, right? He has many other articles where he attacks the idea of changing the halachic ceremony itself, meaning, like, let's say, what the conservative movement was doing or is doing, and is changing the chuppah itself, right? Rav Shagal is saying, no, we are adding another layer to our halachic lifestyle. And that layer could be egalitarian, but it's another layer which is different, which is sometimes contradicting our halachic lifestyle. Okay? I can say personally, we had also, when I got married, we also had two ceremonies. Okay? This notion that we live within a multiple reality is not something that is only found on Dinei Mamonot. It's also not only something, personally, we had two ceremonies, me and my wife, but it's not even only something we can find in something, as crucial and big as a wedding. We can find it in everything, in the way we have a Shabbat meal, in the way we daven in the morning, in everything. Okay? And this idea that halacha is becoming a component that is essential, that we don't give up, we don't change it, but it's a component within a variety of other components, is very radical, at least very radical. Anybody that's feeling this is too radical or not radical enough, any criticism, be happy to hear. Okay, so I'm moving on. Okay, so we talked about tradition, right? And the fact that tradition becomes a component. But there's another aspect to it. And I want now to read a part of Rabbi Udi Dvorkin. Udi Dvorkin is a Rav, again, in Israel, from North African French origin. He's halachic worldview and lifestyle. And he's showing us here how free choice can not only become a component, but it's also how does it affect our traditional life when we talk about traditionalism. Meaning, being traditional, being masorti, holding on to our tradition, not only and as to say this is a part of who we are, but this we want to remain like our parents. We want to remain like 200 years ago. There's a value, there's a merit in just being traditional. But how do we reconcile this with the fact that a lot of people in our community are choosing non-traditional ways of life? So, again, I'll read a bit from Hebrew and then I'll paraphrase. דוגמה קלאסית לגישה הספרדית, is the Sephardic approach. היא פסיקתו של רבי יוסף משאש. And Rav Mashash is very known because he was very lenient. At least today we address him as a very lenient Rav. He didn't see himself, and he was also not lenient in the, let's say, in the halachic discussion form, but eventually his psakim in today's context are considered lenient. בתקופה מסוימת החלו קצבים היהודים בעיר לפתוח את חנויותיהם בשבת. People are not observing Shabbat. And the butchers are opening their shops on Shabbos. כידוע, אסור לאכול בשר של קצב בחייל שבת, and you're not allowed to eat it. Because he's not loyal. If he's not loyal, then he's not kosher. Right? There's no mashgiach standing there. If the butcher is opening on Shabbat, you can't eat it. לפני הרב משאש עמדו שתי אפשרויות. האחת היא לקבוע שאסור לקנות עם חייל שבת. One option was to rule, like almost all Rabbanim in the Ashkenazi world ruled, you can't shop there, right? And to push them away from the community. But he chose a different option. He wrote a halachic answer where he went out of his way to show that the loyalty of a Katzav Mechal Shabbat is only disqualified if he's Mechalel Shabbat be'avera deoraita velo derabanan. And the butcher actions are actually from the second category, right? It's not deoraita, it's the Rabbanan. So they're still loyal. לכן הוא לא פסל את נאמנותם של הקצבים, he didn't disqualify them, and it permits to continue and shop them. Now, we need to understand that the halachic effort he did, Rav Sherki is saying, comes from a position where the community, the fact that the community remains one is a value, a religious value, if you like. Those positions are also to be found in the Ashkenazi community, but they're very rare. For example, Rav Auerbach. Rav Auerbach is, again, a very big known posek in Israel in the Haredi circles, very machmir. And he was asked, can you make egg salad on Shabbos? And there's a lot of questions about egg salad on Shabbos. If you know halacha, egg salad is a very tricky question because there's a lot of questions. And he says, it's mutar. Of course it's allowed. Why? Because my grandmother, Rav Auerbach is saying, was making an egg salad in Shabbos. And even if I won't find a hesber mesapek and enough reasoning halachically, it will still be allowed because my grandmother did that. Okay? This position is very unique. But that was the common position within the Sephardic lifestyle. Okay? And again, another example for this normality is the huge pressure on women and men separation within Ashkenazi Orthodoxy. And he says that created, as a reaction, egalitarian minyanim, partnership minyanim. But in Sephardic circles, it wasn't around. Why? Because over there's a mechitza, but always the Sefer Torah was kissed by women. In Yom Kippur, during Prikat Kohanim, women would enter the Ezrat Gvarim and would stand under the talis, right? And rabbis didn't look the other way. Today, nobody would do it. So what Rav Sherki is telling us is that really there's a concept here that in order to keep the community traditional, we allow non-traditional elements to live and to exist and to be within it. And that is very interesting, to say the least. Because we are used to think about free choice is something that is endangering our community. Now, Tov Sherki is telling us that the value of the community is so strong that we could actually look and view and cherish non-observant or non-observant in the way we want to see them in order to keep the community intact, in order to keep the variety of voices within our community. We need to keep it intact. We don't change our halacha. We don't say what they're doing is permissible, as he says in the last line here. They look the other way. Okay, looking the other way could have a value. Okay, in the postmodern time, okay, you see another narrative, and you look the other way. Okay, it's not my narrative, but I look the other way. I'm not starting a debate with this. Okay, I think that's a very different mentality than the one we usually think about when we think about postmodernism, free choice, and halacha. Any comments on Rav Sherki or any attacks or objections? Okay. The last segment I want to read here, again from Rav Sherki, going back to Rav Sherki, is what's happening when we try to hold each of the solutions or ways or avenues that I've just showed. What is the danger of Torah? Because we spoke so far in the last 40 minutes, what's happening to our values when somebody's choosing Torah differently or not choosing Torah. But there's another problem or danger within our lifestyle. And that is the danger of objectifying Torah, meaning making Torah into an object, into a vessel. And that's something different. And so I'll read from Objectifying. I'll try to read now all the Hebrew because I think it's important, the nusach itself. And as I go, I'll translate. השאלה שצריך כל אדם ולומד לשאול היא מה מקומו. Every person, every student should ask, what is my place? What is my position? לדוגמה, כפי שנראה, לא נוכל ללמוד את כתבי הרב נחמן, כפי שלומדם ומלמדם הרב קניג בשיעורה. We won't be able to study Rav Nachman as Rav Koenig. That's a very famous Rav Nachman teacher within the original Breslev, right, community. We won't be able to teach it like he's teaching. אם ננסה לעשות כן, אנו עלולים להיוותר עם חיקוי גרוע שלא יצליח לגרות במאוד דברים. If we'll try to do it, we'll only have a bad imitation that will not touch on the essence of the facts or of the notions of the Torah. מצד שני, ייתכן שברסלבר לא יחוש את החיסור של הישארות בעולם של לשון הקודש. On the other hand, somebody that's true Breslover, right, true from Breslev, won't feel why it is less remaining within a world of Lashon HaKodesh, within a world of Hebrew. If we'll teach it in Hebrew, right, because Rav Koenig is teaching it in Yiddish. Eventually, eventually, we're living in a world of duality. איננו נמצאים באחדות עם המציאות, אלא מסתכלים על העולם גם מבחוץ. We don't see reality as one, but we see the world from the outside, right? We always have two points of view. Our own point of view as the students, but we also look at ourselves as somebody that's studying right now. For example, I'm teaching now, but I'm also looking, in Zoom it's very physical because I see myself teaching, right, because of the camera. But even when I'm just teaching a shiur in a room or outside, then I'm also thinking, how am I teaching? How do I look like? How many listeners? Who is listening? Who will watch it later and during the recording, only listen to it, there's a lot of things I need to think about. So I'm not only in what's happening, I'm also looking reflectively. יש בכל חיסרון אך גם יתרון. Everything, every downside also has an upside. התרגום הוא המקום המתוקן של דיבור או לימוד מתוך רפלקטיביות. When we translate things, and translating is about choices, and we'll soon see that. It's also about reflecting. לשון העקום, right, the other languages, מסוכנת כיוון שהיא קשורה לתחרות, לניאוף, או לקלקול הברית בלשונו של רבי נחמן. כלומר, מבט אינטרסנטי ומנוכר. And other languages are more risky because they are associated, their conceptual arena a lot of times is attached and linked to competitiveness, to adultery, to kilkul habrit. Not necessarily you say all the people that are talking like this are based on that, but that's just a different cultural landscape in the as Rabbi Nachman, meaning it's a very alienated reality. ובאמת המרחק בין המבט על הדבר מבחוץ לבין חפצונו והפיכתו לאובייקט השליטה אינו גדול, and really, truthful. Seeing something from the outside and objectifying it, controlling it, it's not something very big, meaning I can objectify this lesson now, making it into an object, not really studying Torah with you, but rather looking at Udi, teaching Torah as an object. בהקשר של לימוד תורה, התהליך יכול לכלול לימוד תורה מתוך מקום של רפלקסיה. In the context of studying Torah, this process will include studying Torah from reflection. אולם את השניות הזו עצמה יש לעלות, but this duality itself needs to be risen. וזאת באמצעות מעבר מחיפוש המשמעות, and that's by transitioning ourselves from looking for a meaning, מה ששם את האני במרכז, what's placing me at the center, and may put the text into an object, to a place of inspiration, where שבה אני נותן לטקסט, לקדושה, לדבר, where I'm allowing the text, the Torah, the holiness, the sanctity to speak, and I am becoming the vessel, meaning free choice could make me look at the Torah and think, what can I gain from it? What can I study from it? What can this enable me in the world? This duality that I'm seeing myself and seeing the Torah, right, will enable every choice I will make become what would seem to me objective. I'm objectifying the notion. I'll paraphrase it again. Meaning, what do I say? When we are looking at ourselves from the outside, when we are looking on studying Torah or studying Halacha and observing mitzvot from the outside, there's a very dangerous aspect where we can just look at it as something that is objective. Objective meaning it's 0 or 1, it's binary, right? We won't, and then because we will also be aware of it. So we'll be aware of our danger, as we just read all the different Rabbanim and all the different approaches, rather. We could be aware of this. How will we solve it? We'll try to objectify. We'll say, okay, we are aware of this, so we won't touch the Torah. That's something we won't touch. But when we'll say we won't touch, many times, we'll do the opposite. We'll make the Torah itself an object. Right? Something that we are only using. However, what we really need to be doing is the reverse, what Rav Shagar is saying. We need to make ourselves into something we are using. We are the vessel. I am the vessel. I'm allowing the Torah to speak. I will come to a place of inspiration from the Torah. I won't see the inspiration, right? And choose the inspiration and then use the Torah. But rather, I'll be used in order to find Torah. Okay? So it's sort of reversing our equation. Okay? We need to allow, instead of putting myself, ani, b'merkaz, right? We need to understand. We need to take this duality, and instead of looking at it from the outside and be intimidated by it, right? And losing control over it, we need to see it as something that could be elevated. Where ואילו אני הופך לכלי בלבד, and where I, myself, becomes a vessel. And then each of those ways we just read, each of those approaches, are not relating to halacha, to Torah, as something outside and myself here in this duality, but more elevated, meaning I'm embracing Torah together. Okay. I hope that resonates. I don't know. Is that understandable at all? Aviel, I see. You're the only face I see because you have the courage to show, open your video. So I'm happy with it. But I see your faces is not complete. I don't know if you not completely agree or not completely understanding. So I'll be happy to hear where you are.
So he's saying that the issue of translation is really a reflection of a greater issue, that we're always, there's us and we have to process things or reflect on things. And it's always like a secondary process. And it seems like oftentimes we're afraid of messing things up if we try and make a mistake in our encounter with it, and that can like objectify things. So the way to go is to I guess that is my question. Like, once you have this concern, what can you do about it? Like, how can you be confident that it's not an issue?
So he's asking to not only to be aware of this problem, but to be aware that this problem exists and then to elevate it, meaning to make this problem into a merit. And how do we do this, right? We are transitioning ourselves from looking the meaning trying to understand what the text means, trying to understand what the text says, trying to understand what the approach is, to a place of trying to understand how is this sacred. If we're focusing on Kedusha, we can't objectify it, because Rav Shadar is assuming, and I think rightfully so, we can't objectify Kedusha. Once we objectify Kedusha, we've made it into an object, it's not Kadosh. So if we're always focused on why is it sacred, and to allow the text, the Torah, to speak with me, meaning to be embraced by it, or to be affected by it, then we are allowing this problem to become an advantage. Because we can, exactly as a translation, when we read, what am I doing now in this shiurim, right? I'm trying to translate Rav Shagar and other approaches within Jewish postmodernism into English, but they're written in Hebrew mostly. So translating it could be a very big problem, and it is a problem. However, translating it also enables me to sharpen my understanding of it, because if I'm not focusing on the gap between the English and the Hebrew, but I'm focusing on the fact that I want to understand the text, that the text has a profound impact on me, and I hope on the people that are listening and viewing this shiur, or now in the shiur, then when I'm concentrated on this gap and not on the problem, it allows me to use this disadvantage as an advantage, to strengthen my understanding, to strengthen my identification with the text. Okay? At the same time, Rav Shadar is putting the entire postmodern era as an era of translations, right? We're always trying to translate everything into our own narrative, into our own reality. When we're trying to translate it, we can either be from the outside, observe it, look at it, and just live with that, or we could use this translation, use this narrative, use the fact that we're always bridging between this the Torah and ourselves as an advantage to sharpen our understanding of Kedusha, and then we are becoming less important as individuals, and we're becoming more as a vessel for this Kedusha, because we observe the values in this text, in the Halacha, in the Torah. We take it into ourselves, and then it becomes a part of ourselves. Okay, as Rabbi Nachman is talking about this duality between translation and self.